Hello everybody, and welcome to day 3 of 28 days to master level chess tactics. So in this video, we're on day 3 and we're closing out Annihilation of Defense. I'm going to give you two positions in this video, kind of a basic warm-up, what I'm calling basic in this course, and then a final advanced position. I want you to keep in mind to always look for your opponent's possibilities during your calculations. And I know calculation and visualization is not an easy topic, but that's why I started this course, because it seems like a lot of players, they can solve tactics, they can learn some basic pattern recognition, but they really kind of have trouble of putting it together in more real game scenarios. All right, so let's just jump into this position. It's white to move, and I'm going to keep the thought process down below here. Let's just get into it. This is basically a position where you can see that, well, white has an extra pawn, but essentially he has tons of activity on the king side. And, well, the queen and the bishop are a little discoordinated. They're in the center and on the queen side, but you can calculate two minor pieces, a rook and a queen, versus the king and the rook and the bishop. All right, so you want to look at forcing variations of your opponent, just to keep those in mind. And, I mean, it looks like the queen could take here. Obviously, you notice that the bishop's threatening the queen and the bishop. But basic tactics come into play. You see that if the bishop just took here, then actually, for example, I'll just play it here so you can see it. Bishop takes. You really want to see these kind of things because they're easy to miss. Queen takes. And now, actually, it looks like black would be mating, unfortunately for white, with bishop to d6. So this is a perfect illustration of always keeping your opponent's forcing ideas in mind, because you can immediately discount something like bishop takes. You'd love to say, okay, I'd love to just checkmate, but the bishop's covering there. He'd just take, and I don't see any follow-up. If the bishop took, then it's basically one move too late with queen takes f2. So you can discount that. Now, you really want to start, if you're having trouble in your calculations and they seem kind of messy in your head, what I would recommend is after you understand your opponent's forcing variations, go piece by piece and start with, the queen, you can go to the rooks and then the minor pieces, and go from there to kind of do it in an organized fashion. Now, in a real game, you're probably not going to be that organized because you'll be deep into understanding the position, but in these kind of positions, you kind of start from square one. Queen takes bishop looks very logical because the advanced h-pawn and the rook on the h-file are also aiming towards the king on h8, and with the minor pieces, it's quite a lot of piece coordination there. So you'd have to look at queen takes. And after h takes g, then the follow-up would be pawn to h5. And now because the knight is blockading, he's basically threatening a mate in 1, or I guess 2, with the queen interposing. And there's really not that much that he can do about it. The computer suggests queen takes, but after queen takes, here, the rook gets a check. But you can easily evaluate that he's up an entire rook, and because it's the knight taking with check, he's not even going to be able to win back the piece. You could just give a check there, even go knight, and then there's a lot of moves here. Takes, check, and then you can see that white escapes with an extra rook. So that would be a quite easy evaluation there. But if he doesn't give away his queen, you have to look at also in these kind of positions, especially when you give up a queen or any kind of even a exchange sacrifice, you want to look at potential forcing replies that kind of ruin your entire position. So rook takes f7 is something you definitely need to look at. And you'd say, okay, h takes g, he gets a check. And now, I know this is somewhat complicated, but the final basic tactic in this position is the knight fork. And then he wins the queen. So I chose this position because it includes a lot of basic tactics in concert together to create an awesome combination. So let's just go back to the beginning and see what conclusions we can draw from this position before we move on to the advanced one. Queen takes. There's really no check. I mean, obviously we talked about queen takes check. And then you'd look at all these forcing variations. It's either knight check, but then if he does knight check, then king to h7 kind of ruins your plans, because if the pawn takes, then basically all the mating options are done. For example, here, he's losing. After h takes g check, king goes over, you have to be able to see this knight fork. You'd also look at rook check, and you could, I guess, win a rook, but the bishop's covering this square, and it's not so good. It makes it more complicated. I mean, it still wins. So if you did select rook to h8 check, then you're up material, and you do have a passed pawn that's protected, but it allows black more counterplay, and I talked about that in the last video. You want to try to reduce all the counterplay. And going into an endgame is a great way to do that, trading pieces when you're up material. And basically, when you trade pieces and you're up material, it just amplifies your material advantage. So that's why you want to do that. All right, let's get into the advanced puzzle now. All right, we are on the final puzzle of day 3, Annihilation of Defense. And I'll give you a moment to pause the video if you want to solve this now. And let's just get into it. From the beginning of this position, you can see that material is equal, but the position and activity is completely unequal. Black has a rook and 2 minor pieces sitting on the 8th rank, and a king completely in the center. Of course, the king likes to be surrounded by his pieces when queens are still on the board, but they're quite discoordinated, and the pawn cover is completely destroyed. Now, this is why you want to religiously follow in the opening the 3 main things of developing your minor pieces, connecting your rooks, and castling to protect your king, as well as develop your rook. You can see that probably black didn't do any of that in this position. So this should lend you to look for forcing variations. Now, obviously, we're trying to get rid of black's defenses and potentially mate him or win a lot of material. But in order to do that, to go from general to specific, you have to first understand the main purpose of your moves. So in this position, if your calculations are a bit messy, you want to do it in an organized fashion. So let's do that. So black, you can see that he's threatening the c3 knight, but it's double protected by the rook and the queen. And I guess this e6 pawn is threatened by the knight and the rook. So let's just keep that in mind, but they're not very serious threats. The knight could come to d5. There's a bishop check. You notice this queen takes rook check. Even though it looks crazy, you want to kind of keep the mind of a child when you are looking at complicated tactical positions, because your pattern recognition can sometimes trip you up and make you get tunnel vision. The forcing moves thing that I talk about is what really leads to finding sudden tactical wins. Because if you just keep your mind open and you look at, okay, what if queen takes rook, then that will lead you down the correct path. And obviously a bishop check, then the rook could just take. Yeah, I mean, there's other moves like knight d5, but you want to spend most of your time looking at forcing moves. So we want to look at queen takes h6. And that should be your first candidate move. So after pawn takes, then you'll investigate the check. And there's basically 2 moves. So if the knight comes in, you could just take it with check, or you could just pile up with rook to f1, or even bring in another piece. For example, here, I mean, you could just play knight to d5, and then that actually closes off the king, and you have plenty of time to take this knight, and you're going to get a ton of activity. So technically, you gave your queen for a rook, but this is where your evaluation and your calculation comes into play. Now, I'm not trying to simplify piece activity. I'm actually trying to learn how to apply it in these videos. And I'm not saying it's a simple thing, but it's what should guide you when you're evaluating during your calculations. So let's go back again. The more logical move would be to bring the king up instead of just giving away a piece. And so we need to look at that first. He's threatening this pawn. And then the next logical check would be knight to d5. But of course the king can take the pawn, which is actually the only move in this position. And so the forcing moves give you less options to calculate, which makes your basically your practical ideas a little easier to look at. All right, so you could bring the rook over and close the king off potentially in a mating net, although he can escape here. But let's say you bring the rook over and he tries to escape. Well, you could just see that you could just take the bishop and you still have the check and a check over here. And that's where your calculations should go to see that your activity is closing around the king and he still doesn't have any active pieces. And that's at that point is when you should evaluate the material. So you'd have basically a rook and a bishop for a queen at that point, and you could safely say that you have an advantage. But let's keep looking at it. So rook to f1, you could just do bishop check, but then he could potentially escape. And with the king coming either back in the center or even over here, he can get more pieces in. So we kind of want to keep the king's activity as low as possible. So rook to f1 check is most logical. And then you could bring a check in here. And then his only move, basically, I mean, if he goes knight here, then basic tactics come into play. If the bishop comes in, you just take it. And if he moves, then you just take the queen. And he's still pinned against the rook here, like this. And you win that knight. And if he goes here, then you get rook check. And it basically drives the king in. Let's see here. So you could just check here. Looks like he goes over. You could just take. And then, all right, let's see. Takes. Yeah, and then you get a forced checkmate with king to b2. Notice that there's no way to stop the rook coming in, and the bishop, the knight, the pawn, and the king cover all the squares and deliver checkmate on the a-file. So the only move would be basically queen check or queen takes check. There's no interposition. All right, so a very long calculation, but you can see that there was only one or two potential moves in each move along the variation. I know this last position was quite difficult, although it was quite forced, but I want to say that you're not going to get all of these right. I solve these kind of puzzles and get them wrong all the time, but what I do is I go back and I try to perform what should have been a perfect calculation. And that's really why I'm presenting these positions. Not necessarily so you can solve it and get every variation, but so that you can learn the patterns in specific complicated tactics like annihilation of defense. And in day 4, we're going to start looking at double attack to kind of go back to basics, which I guess every tactic is based on a double attack. And so I'd like you to always go back into these complicated positions and try to perform a complete thought process. And so you want to go back to the beginning and edit how your mind should have worked to correctly solve the position. And these little adjustments in your thought process is how you'll get better and better at chess. And it is a long, ongoing process. It's not easy. It takes a lot of work. But if you're willing to do the work, then these videos and positions can benefit you greatly. Thanks for following along, and I'll see you in day 4 of 28 days to master level chess tactics, where we level up and we're going to the next level. All right, thanks, and I'll see you in the future.
Don't fret if you got the solution wrong. There will be another time you can hear my lonesome song. Maybe when you here for a while,